Ladies and gentlemen, and kind people from all around the world, we're coming at you from Carolopolis. Yes, this is the Paul Leslie Hour. We wholeheartedly thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy your time with us today. Now, before we start the show, there are some words from American founding father George Washington. Now, I'm quoting here. If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep, to the slaughter. That comes from the Newburgh Address, March 15, 1783. Our guest today is a believer in free speech and our inalienable rights. Our host, Paul Leslie, has an interview in this episode with Paul T. Leslie. Hey, another Paul Leslie? Could this be? Well, more on that in a moment. This interview with Paul T. Leslie is a long time coming, and we're glad it's here. These topics are heavy, but the kind of questions that the Paul Leslie Hour likes to explore. Just a brief announcement, folks. You can keep this show coming by going to the paulleslie.com/support. We thank everyone who contributes. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I will leave it with the Pauls. Both of them.
Well, thank you, Dan. So today is a very special occasion. I've done many, many interviews on this show, now numbering in the hundreds and hundreds. This one is special. This is someone who is very close to me. Birth name, Paul T. Leslie. This is my father I'm going to be talking to. And these are questions I like to think about. They're questions that I think are starting point questions that can get you going in all kinds of directions, but they're very important things to think about, and I'm very glad that we have this chance to talk.
Me too, Paul.
So I think just before we begin, if we could get just a little bit, where were you born?
Altoona, Pennsylvania, 1946, November 1st.
What part of the state of Pennsylvania is that?
It's called, I guess you would say West Central.
West Central.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, there's it's in the mountains. The Appalachian Mountains run up through the center of Pennsylvania. Altoona is built in the mountains. You know, my earliest memories are looking out the streets and seeing the mountain ranges on either side. It was great sledding for a kid.
So you were born just after World War II.
Yeah.
And there were many, many Americans born during that time. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're considered to be part of the baby boomers, and I'm on the early edge of that.
Right.
So, yeah. Me and my sister Sharon, she was born a year before I was, so 45 and 46. So it was right after, like you said, the end of World War II. And my father didn't fight in the war, but all the soldiers, Marines, sailors all came home and started a life, and starting a life for many of them was starting a family. So.
When you think about that time, when you were growing up in the 40s and 50s,
yeah,
did you have much of an identity in terms of being an American?
Yeah, I did. I can speak for myself, and I'm surprised at some of the memories that I have. If I remember correctly, I think like the Soviet Union when they invaded Hungary, and I can remember seeing pictures of the tanks rolling into to suppress the revolt that they had. Other kinds of things too, like when Castro took over Cuba. Those are really still in me fresh memories. And when I was a little bit older, I can remember. Well, I don't even know. I shouldn't even say a little bit older. I was still probably just a real little boy, but it was probably related to shortly after the war. But like either Memorial Day parade or something like that, of going to the parade with my mother and me and my sister Sharon, and standing there and seeing all the troops marching through the city streets of Altoona. And that was my first exposure, and I still remember it to this day, the little poppies, and, asking about the poppies and what was involved in that. So, for me, I've always been conscious of those kinds of things. So,
how would you describe from your memory America in the 50s?
I often think back to that period of time now, because I'm old enough to have lived through a lot of changes and seen great changes in the country. When I was a little boy, like I said, like living in Altoona, and I can relate it to when I was in first and second grade. And I know it was related to at least that because by third grade, I'd moved to another location, just a couple blocks from this one. But where I lived in Altoona, Pennsylvania, it was real close to the railroad shops. Across the street from me was a huge ball field. And then beyond that were all open fields and what was a National Guard armory. And for me and my friends, we'd walk up to the corner store, have like maybe a quarter, and my mother would make a sandwich for us. We'd buy a bottle of pop, maybe a candy bar, pack it in our knapsack. We'd go over to the National Guard fields they already had because they did training for the military there, foxholes and things like that. So it was a great place for us to play Army. But the point that I'm making out of that, not that I played Army so much, was the freedom that we had because we would basically be gone. And we'd walk for big distances all through those fields and woods, exploring streams and all those kind of stuff. And now when I see, people are afraid to let their kids play in their front yard. So I've seen, like changes that to me are not for the better, but they're a loss of what America used to be. Every once in a while, like on Facebook, for example, I'll see a post where they talk about something like, what did it mean when the streetlights came on? Well, it meant it was time to go home for dinner, because other than that, we didn't sit at home, play games on the computer or anything like that. We were in the streets, riding bikes, playing basketball, swimming and all of that. And we were just free to go out and run and burn off energy and play. And I think there's a lot of that that's lost in America today. So.
What kind of stuff did you read when you were a youngster?
I can't remember that a lot. One thing I can remember is listening to. I grew up listening to classical music. My dad, he loved it, and I think it was back on those old 78 RPMs, but I used to love that. And I did read, and I just can't remember, but I can remember reading things like The Last of the Mohicans and things like that when I was young. And when my family moved from Altoona, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I was in, I think, let me see, how old would I have been? I think like fourth grade or something like that. We had to take turns reading in the class. And they stopped when it was my turn to read, and the teacher came and hugged me because I could read, and that came just because I read, already on my own. But I can't remember a lot about, all the books that I read, so.
But you said that you were into classical music.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I still love it today. I don't listen to it as much, but it hits a note in me that I respond to. Because to me it's very evocative. Of all kinds of emotions. There's one that's a favorite of mine that I've enjoyed it as an adult. I don't think I listened to that particular piece. I don't know when it was created. Ralph Vaughan Williams. What was it called now? The Flight of the Sparrow, I think it's called. I get in that, and then I just listen to it. I get take it to another place. So.
Well, right outside the window here, there are these birds. And they're making some sound, and they're eating from a feeder. Uh-huh. Have you always been someone who loved animals?
Yeah. Like I said, I grew up in nature. When I was a little kid, like I said, me and my buddy, we would tromp through the woods, like I said, exploring streams, etc. And, I can remember catching salamanders and frogs and snakes. We were the bad boys. I don't think they would do it so much now, but I'd take snakes to school in my pocket and collect garter snakes. Other ones we called grass snakes, had red racers. And I can remember catching some of them, keeping them in a little box. And then my father was a hunter. And so from early, before I wasn't allowed to hunt, I was way too young. But I would accompany him on certain kinds of hunts. I can remember walking through the woods with him, squirrel hunting. He used to hunt groundhogs a lot. So, I'd go and I'd be not the gun bearer, but he had like sticks with a leather strap on to rest the rifle on, because they would shoot, really long distances. So that was like my part of it, so. But I grew up hunting, and all my life I've been interested in the outdoors.
Do you see an increased separation from people and the natural world in these times?
Oh, my, yes. Like I referenced Facebook earlier, and every once in a while I'll see there'll be a thread on Facebook that will start, and then maybe it'll show a guy with an animal that he, has shot. And the hostility that it draws is just amazing. And they consider him to be a murderer and the death of the animal to be murder, And you see and hear people talk about, they think that all the meat, like if you want beef, well, that comes from the grocery store. It doesn't come from the farmer's field and the meat packing plant, So, yeah, there's a great gulf in that. When we moved to South Philadelphia, I could remember, like I said, we lived out in the mountains. I lived in the city, but it was in the mountains. And I had relatives that were farmers and other things like that. So I was always connected to nature and farms and fields, etc. But friends of ours in Philadelphia one time went with us up to Altoona. And we were youngsters then, like maybe 6th, 7th grade, something like that. And they were astounded when we went past some farm fields and they saw cows. It was the first time they'd ever even seen a cow in their life. So
that's sad.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Well, I want to get into some of the meaty questions.
All right.
How much of who we are is our choice, and how much is what we're born with?
When you ask how much, I can't answer that. I don't know how to quantify it.
Right.
That question, though, is one that I started to think about or become aware of. I'll put it that way. Not when I was real young, but when I first started to go to school and college, that is. And, you'd find people talking about it. And then I suppose what you're asking is the nature versus nurture kind of an issue.
Right.
And I don't know how to quantify that. Some of the things that I remark on for myself, though, in thinking about it, number one, on the one side, let's go like from the nature part of it. Every once in a while, I'll say something or tell a joke or something like that, or my sister Sharon will do it. And, we'll chide each other because it was the same corny joke that our dads, said. And, I'm sure you've probably heard the line that when you get old enough, soon you're going to find out that, you're a lot like your parents, your father, your mother, et cetera.
Right.
So, to me, there's a part that you can't divorce from what we're born with. Our genes, I look at you, I'm sorry, but I see a lot of me, in your visage. So there's that part of it. But then on the other hand, as it relates to, nurture, the things that you grow up with. Like I said, my upbringing wasn't what your upbringing was. I had freedoms that you didn't experience. So I don't, know how to separate all of that. But in balancing it or thinking it through in my own mind, one of the things that I think about, though, is although I am a product of my parents' genes, and their influences, the way they raised me and other things like that. But I'm also still a unique individual, created by God as me and myself alone, And in that respect, I think that then I'm fully responsible for all of my own choices, all of my own decisions, my acts, they're mine. I know that there's some kind of influence in them, but yet, they're me and mine, and I'm responsible for them. So how to quantify all that, I don't know.
Do we all have a fate?
I don't believe that at all. I totally reject the idea of fatalism. And with it, now like lately, say, for example, I do a lot of, like arguing with political issues on Facebook. And, I hear and I know, they'll talk about like some of the bad things that, say, like Biden has done or some other kind of politician. And they talk about karma getting you.
Right.
Well, I don't believe in karma and I don't believe in fate. I believe that, again, like I'll tie it to what I just said, that I'm born as an individual and I have responsibility for me and I have the freedom for my choices and decisions, opinions and beliefs, actions, everything. And so, with that, I just reject the idea of fatalism.
What's the difference between wisdom and intelligence?
The difference that I would see in it, and again, I'm going to tie it into another kind of a thing because I've already talked about creation, and pretty much everything I'm going to say ties it in with this. The Bible talks about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And the fear of the Lord, as I understand it, has to do with knowledge of Him, respect, reverence, awe, accountability, all of those things, tied into it. When I talk about the fear of the Lord, I have to interject another word or associate another word with it, and that would be truth. Because God is truth, Jesus is truth, the word that He has left us, that is truth. Intelligence, as I understand it, again, like I'll tie it in with what you asked about, like how much of me is nature nurture. I think there's part of what we have by way of our intelligence that comes from our genetic makeup, what our intellectual capabilities are, etc. But to me, intelligence is more than that. It also involves, what we've given ourselves to by way of study, by learning, whether formally or informally. The way I would understand the difference between them is that wisdom is, I don't want to say, the ability to apply your intelligence to make judicious decisions. I know the word is used and it has a sense where we understand it, but I know technically there is no such thing as common sense. But for our purposes and to understand it that way, I think that's part of what wisdom is to be able to make good decisions based on your intelligence, on the things that you know, to apply, I guess, truth to whatever situation that you're in. So,
well, this is a very common thing that you hear in these days. So this, I think, is a good question to ask people. Is truth subjective?
I can answer that in one word: no. Not even. What to me is interesting is I debate with some of the people who want to argue that point. And they'll do it in a couple of ways. One, that there is just absolutely no such thing, as objective truth, that it's relative. You have your truth, I have my truth.
Right.
And that's the extent of truth. What's interesting about that, especially when I hear it applied by various kinds of Marxists, when they espouse their view, which they don't really have any facts to back it up, but in denying you the position that there is such a thing as objective truth, they dismiss it totally. But to dismiss it totally, then they themselves are standing on what they're going to say. Yeah, they won't say it that way, but for them it's an objective truth.
Right.
It's an objective truth that there is no objective truth. So they deny themselves in that regard. Now, for me, I've already mentioned a couple of times, taking it back to God, truth, His word. That has to be the cornerstone of all truth. Cornerstone for a couple of reasons. One, because He is the creator. He is the first cause. There is no truth without that. As I understand it, there is no science without that. Because we have an ordered universe. Our body is that way. My body is a lot like yours. You can go to the doctor and the doctor can treat you because he knows the intricacies of your creation, but it's my creation too. It's all ordered. Even the idea of mathematics, it doesn't make sense. The world didn't start with the Big Bang. An explosion doesn't create order. And to me, it's kind of laughable that people say that there is no such thing as objective truth. So.
Well, when you have something that you believe or that you know, why should someone be unafraid to share what they believe?
I think that there's a sense where you can be unafraid, and I think there's also a place where there is fear.
Sure.
For example, we live in a cancel culture.
Right.
And you get attacked for saying the truth. And so I think it's natural to have fear for what could happen to you. You know, it's like President Trump, to have his ability to communicate on Twitter, to be kicked out of the public square. Some people have lost their jobs. They've lost their income. So there is a natural part of fear. But for me, then the issue comes down to is, do I have the courage to speak the truth? And am I going to stand up and say what is right? Am I going to say what I believe is to be true? Am I going to defend my principles? So yeah, there can be fear, but do you have the courage to act beyond your fear and to speak the truth?
What do you think the reward is when you speak the truth and you're penalized for it?
One of the rewards for me is your own integrity, that you have stayed true to yourself and to your beliefs, your convictions. You know, you might pay the price for it. I did that. I don't know how much you know about it, Paul. I don't know if I've ever told you the details about it. But when I was a professor in the Philippines, I, through study, came to understand a particular verse in Scripture that really went against the theology of the group that I was associated with. When I studied, as a matter of fact, one time I was looking at it and studying it from the Greek. I called up a friend of mine. He was also the leader of our school. And I said, John, you look at this. This particular verse in Scripture saying is that if you're divorced and if you remarried, you have not sinned. Okay? That was anathema to the group that I was with. But at any rate, what happened then is one time when I was teaching down in, I think it was Iloilo City in the Philippines, to a group of mostly Filipinos, but there were other students there too. I taught that, and I explained why. You know, that this Greek word, you know, the meaning of it, how it was used, etc. And I knew that it would get blowback. And it did get blowback, and I was then required to go and talk with the president of we met on the college campus of a Filipino school. And, you know, I basically got not invited, but summons to an inquisition for, you know, teaching what I believed to be. But I felt that I was true to the Scriptures, and I had to say what I said. I paid a price for it, but my conscience was cleared. So I was banned from ever even teaching there again because of that. So.
Have you noticed a growing obsession with safety?
Yeah.
Hard to not.
Yeah, and the reason there's a growing obsession with safety, as I look at it, is that there's a growing obsession of fear. Mm-hmm. And obsession is maybe not the right word to use, but it is in this sense. When I look at history, from the French Revolution to today, totalitarians and the French revolutionists were totalitarians. And actually, for me, it was the root of Marxism that came with the Jacobins in the French Revolution. Everyone who knows anything about the French Revolution is familiar with the word guillotine, because lots of heads rolled. You know, it was a horrible period. But it was also called the Reign of Terror. And those totalitarians, much like Marxists of today, had similar beliefs, hated God, hated Christianity. They arrogate to themselves the prerogatives of God, but they ruled through terror and fear, because terror and fear is a great motivator.
Yeah.
You can control people through that. I'll jump ahead just to touch point, you know, with what I'm looking at today. We just ended up, I shouldn't say we ended up, we're leaving 2 years of mass fear, intentionally produced fear. And when I say we're leaving it, I just went to the doctors the other day and they're warning me before I go into the office, put your mask on, and for me, it's long time ago, we should have had those masks off, but people are still operating in fear. And to me, it was all intentionally produced. And it was intentionally produced for the same reason that the French revolutionists did. It was to control. Lenin and Stalin, Marxists, no real difference than the French revolutionaries. They, made the cold, calculated decision to rule in fear. Hitler, also a Marxist, same cold calculation to rule in fear. Fear does a number of things to people, but when we look at what fear did to those societies and to those people, is it crushed their spirit, for one thing. And I look at here in America what took place over the past 2 years. The fear that I see was used to crush much of what it means to be an American, to be a free person, to have individual rights. And those rights include not only the right to speak, because all of the social media sites censored you for what they called disinformation, which was simply nothing but a weapon to crush free speech. Not only did they crush free speech, but they crushed free association. You weren't allowed to go here. You weren't allowed to go there. You were limited. 6 people here, used to be, now you can't do it. They crushed freedom of religion. I can remember one of the earlier stories that came out of when they first started the, I'll say clampdown, lockdown, whatever, when they had police force arresting people who met in a church parking lot, sitting in their cars. Yeah. So the clampdown was even to crush freedom of worship, freedom of association, freedom of speech. And to me, one of the greatest, and it really, really irritates me to this day, and it makes my heart break, is how many people lost their businesses. Yeah. And it was purposeful. They just had their property, their livelihoods crushed by the government, taken away. And when I see what happens too in taking away their property, their rights, their employment, their livelihoods, it crushed their families, and it enriched all the big people, their colleagues. Amazon growth went through the roof. Right. And the owner of Amazon is a tyrant. He's a Marxist. He's an anti-American bully, who is a comrade of the Democrat Party. So, I just see it as a great assault on the middle class of America, on the individual of America, to crush our rights and our liberty. So, and that's how much of that was fear. Fear was the cornerstone of it. They started it off with the bogus projection of 220 million people might die. And nobody knew what this new virus was. And they keyed on that. And now, from my reading, I've learned, too, that all of these lockdown processes and the procedures that they implemented had all been developed years ahead of time. Right. And so they're waiting for the opportunity to use them. Again, to me, I can put it in these words. Not only did it crush the middle class, which the middle class is the strength of this country, but I look at it as a coup upon America. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to live freely and also live in fear?
Yeah. And it gets back to what I said earlier about courage. And I'm not trying to make this sound anything like grandiose or anything like that. But I mentioned that I go on Facebook. I get censored. I get locked up in 30 days Facebook jail about every other month. But it's not going to stop the way I speak. Now, like I said, I'm not trying to make that grandiose, but I'm going to speak what is truth. And I'm going to speak my truth against the evil of the Democrats. And it's the lie of the Democrats. And I'm going to do that no matter what. So, to live freely and in fear, I'm going to live, there's fear of what the government will do. And we're seeing more and more how our government, especially under the Democrat Party, is really the Gestapo or the KGB. And my wife has said to me often, you shouldn't write that. You're going to be on their list. I know that, but I'm going to speak my truth. So yeah, we can live free, and there's fear, but you have to have, a certain amount of courage to say what you believe and not be silenced.
If someone was to ask, how does one live freely? How would you answer that? How does one live freely?
I'll tie it back again, like with something that I said earlier. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I talked about, like truth and topics like that earlier. So for me, that's part of like knowing that you have to, that God has to be honored. Your convictions have to be honored. What I am as a child of God in the sense of creation, that has to be honored. And I'm an individual. If I'm going to be an individual created to be free, to have an opinion, to have a voice. And so even though you might face a threat, if you're going to be free, you have to do it. Because if you're not, you've all of a sudden become a subject. And I'm not going to live on my knees, especially to a Marxist Democrat. It's not going to happen. So, and something that I read some time ago now, I don't remember the name of the book, but I was interested in it because I was reading about Germany and Hitler and all of that, and how the Germany of the 30s was a very cosmopolitan, on the cutting edge in science and so many other kinds of things, and by and large, a Christian nation. And how was it then that they came to be under the thumb of Marxist dictator? So I said, well, I'd like to read the history of Germany. I've never read like the old history of Germany. I've read lots about, World War II Germany. But I read this book that told the history of Germany all the way back hundreds of years before Christ. These wild German tribes. But they had something that, they were scattered throughout all the woods in Germany. And they had, like when a man became an age, like a boy, a teenager, you weren't a man until you got a weapon. And when you had that weapon, then like you could come to the council meetings when they gathered the tribes and got together like their clans. And, part of that was like to be a warrior, to be free, and to be a responsible, man and a responsible citizen. But you had to be brave to do that, so.
A phrase that is a part of our founding is the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
What do you think the pursuit of happiness means?
Well, I think it means a whole lot more than the way we would talk about just being happy.
Right.
Do you feel good today? Right. I think it's more than that. From what I've read, a lot of the word happiness, and I'm not going to say that they're like synonyms, but in the context of the discussions that the founders had with happiness, that you'd often see the word property used.
Right.
So, and again, they're not synonyms, but they're related. And I think they're related in this sense that, again, speaking of our rights, only some of them were just, enumerated in the Declaration, in the Bill of Rights, but not all. And I think part of Western civilization and how we understand what we are as the creation of God, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that the pursuit of happiness is kind of like, to me, an extension of life and liberty. And life and liberty lived in society, with other people. Because right after that phrase in the Declaration, then it talks about, because of this, we have just government is organized, to be able to protect our rights. And part of that as a responsible citizenship, to me, involves the right of property, and that I'm like a property owner, a responsible citizen. I'm exercising all of my rights, individual. And so I see it kind of like as a full thing like that. talk about maybe like living to the full potential of what I am as a free man. That's how I understand it to be, like the pursuit of happiness. And again, I used the word earlier, the phrase, not as a subject, that I have a right to my opinion, I have a right to my voice, I have a right to my worship, I have a right to my free association, I have a right to this property, that this is my home, this is my domicile, that I have for my family, etc. And it's interesting to me that, like, with those rights, that what we see now, I can't remember how many years ago it's been, but there's a growing, from the Democrats especially, a growing assault on property rights. And for me, it's infringing on all of those rights.
Well, this, I think, is a really big question, and I like asking people this. So I'll ask you,
All right.
Where do rights come from?
Well, I've mentioned it a couple times already, I think. I've talked often about, first cause, which would be God, our Creator, my rights come from God, etc. Our founding fathers, knew that. That's the cornerstone, to me, of the foundation of America. Where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So for me, our rights come from God by virtue of what I am, as a creation of God. Same for all people, men, women. And to me, again, it's interesting that, I mentioned the French Revolution. That was one of the first things that they attacked, was our individual rights in our relationship to God and Christianity. They knocked down, churches, they killed priests, etc., instituted their own religion. And it was interesting, too, that in the French Revolution, this thought just came into my mind, they even began it like as a new creation. That, okay, now we're on day one, year one. They marked it as a beginning of time. And I find it interesting because creation obviously went before the French Revolution. But it, to me, is the mindset of totalitarians. And I see it in the communists, I see it in the fascists, I see it in the Nazis, and I see it also in the Democrats. The Democrats are doing the same thing. Because all of them arrogate to themselves the prerogatives of God. And we see that in the Democrats specifically with their assault on infants. And I call it a genocide, where they have slaughtered 60 million babies, innocent babies. They've outstripped any communists. They've outstripped, by far, the genocide of Hitler. They've outstripped the genocide of Stalin. They've outstripped the genocide of Mao. And they've killed 60 million innocent babies. And to me, it comes from, the same thing, rights. They don't see that people have rights. They deny the right to life of 60 million innocents. In America, well, for me, from the beginning, Democrats have never, ever had any respect for the values and principles of our founding. And I can just illustrate that very, very quickly just by two things. It's the beginning of the Democrats. They saw themselves as white supremacists. They identified themselves that. Now, today they'll deny it, of course, and they try to make Republicans to be the white supremacists. But they were the slavers. Not only were they the slavers, but Andrew Jackson was the one who instigated the Trail of Tears and purging the Southeast, where we live now, of all the Cherokees. So they're racists. As time went on, of course, they demonstrated their tyranny, too, in tearing the Union apart and plunging the nation into what I call their war of rebellion. And that was, in large measure, to do away with our Constitution, which was formed to protect the rights of individuals. Now, the Democrats were only interested in protecting the rights of whites because I don't know if you know, that they developed their own Constitution. And that Constitution was purposefully constructed to acknowledge white supremacy and the inferior position of blacks, that they were always to be slaves That was in their Constitution. So that was one of the big reasons behind the Civil War. Democrats did it again later in the early 1900s under Wilson. And again, they got rid of our Constitution. Now, they did it in a bold way, but yet in a sneaky kind of way, which is something that Marxists are always doing. But Wilson, when he talked about our Constitution, I'll back up and I'll talk about the Declaration first. He said, like Democrats today too, and I said they have never had any respect or regard for the values and principles of our founding. Wilson said that the Declaration of Independence was nothing more than a relic of its time, that it was irrelevant to us today, that basically the Constitution was relegated only to the period of the Revolution. He used terms to describe it that it's nothing more than a list of grievances. Let's say just grievances, but that's all that it is. But what he did purposefully is the section that we just talked about a little while ago, that, we acknowledge that our rights came from God. That's the part that Wilson didn't like. And that's the part that he ignored. And that's the part that he wanted to get rid of. Because Democrats do not acknowledge that our rights come from God. It wasn't long after Wilson that another Democrat followed, who I would consider to be a real fascist. And he's one of the Democrats' greatest heroes, FDR. But FDR followed in that same thing with the development of Marxism in the Democrat Party by issuing what is called the Second Bill of Rights. That's been picked up even today. Biden has done the same thing. He has regurgitated, I'll use that word, the Second Bill of Rights. Not long ago, Biden, in talking about, because he's come right out and said that he wants to take away the right of all law-abiding Americans to bear arms. And he said that our rights, I can't remember the word, I think I jotted it down. Yeah, he said they're not absolute. They most certainly are absolute because they're granted by God. But over the last century plus, Democrats have fought against those rights. And it gets back to that same principle again, from the French Revolution to the Communist Revolution to the Nazi takeover of Germany. All of these Marxists arrogate to themselves the prerogatives of God. The Democrats today are doing the same thing. They tell us that no, rights don't come from God, they come from the state. That the state has the prerogative to grant rights and to control rights and even to remove rights. And when I talk about removing rights, look how much they're censoring today and crushing free speech. So even, killing people's businesses because they don't like what they do in their work or what their beliefs are. So.
I've commonly stumped people when they've said, well, rights clearly come from our government. And I say, well, if rights come from our government, then governments always change.
Yeah.
How are you in any way going to keep your rights?
Yeah.
Never, ever gotten really a solid answer.
Another part of that, too, Paul, would be if rights come from government, they're a privilege granted,
right?
Not an actual right. They're a temporary privilege.
Right. So, if it comes from government, it can be revoked at any time.
Yeah. What the government can give you, they can take away.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, how is America unique?
I think a lot of what I've been talking about for this past period of time kind of relates to it because I've touched on it from the very, very beginning, talking about what we are by way of creation. When I say what we are by way of creation, our founders, they started off their thinking that way. They talked about what we learned from natural rights. They talked about the God of nature. When they talked about the God of nature, they weren't talking about some kind of a pantheistic idea of God, but they're talking about the God who is the creator of all, the ruler of nature. The founders, when I read a book not too long ago. To me, it was really fascinating. And I'm going to give it to you later because I think you were asking about like a book recommendation. they argued with each other for 15 years about what America is going to be. I mean, the questions are, I'm amazed at our founders, because when you look at the things that they argued about, their points of reference in the discussion, talking about what the Greek philosopher said, what Roman senators talked about, that was like common knowledge to them all. They talked about philosophy. They talked about theology, and they argued back and forth with it. So that by the time it came time then to really, I'll say, birth America, they had really settled ideas about what it was. And what it was is unlike any nation that has ever been created in the history of the world. It was founded, like I said, on the idea of, that God's creation. And so it's different and unique in that way. There's no other nation that is founded on biblical principles that I know of, that I'm aware of. And, that they would argue and debate it and think about it that way too. America didn't come into being the product of, look at so many or nations around the world. They're either run by like a dictator who has, a legacy, pass it down to his sons or whatever, or royalty, the divine rights of kings, or, whatever, or some kind of feudalistic society or whatever. America was born as a free nation. So that's a unique thing. I know years ago, like Obama was asked that question, and in typical Democrat fashion, he had no regard for the exceptionalness of America. Matter of fact, he's apologized for America. But he said, yeah, we are exceptional in the same sense that English people are going to say we're exceptional. But it's not, or, anybody else or French people are going to say we're exceptional. No, to me, it has to do with what we are, how we came into being, the fact that we, even the phrase as it begins like, we the people. Mm. No nation is ever born by we the people. And, with that phrase, we the people, it isn't that they just met together, but, to say, yeah, let's do this. But it's also a statement of where the authority is in our nation, that we are a self-governing people, that we are free. We enter into an agreement to have a government to protect our rights, but the authority is in the individual Americans, together. So to me, there's so much about what America is as an exceptional nation, not in a braggadocious kind of way, but there's a lot to be awful proud about, that we are privileged to live in this country and have a heritage of individual rights and liberty that people around the world don't have. Just what last month in Canada with the truckers' strike, for example,
right?
They saw the tyranny that can easily crush free speech. More than free speech, that clown up there, Trudeau, was hauling away trucks and the livelihoods of people, crushing them on what basis, on what authority? Well, Canada, same as England, and same as Australia. Australia, during the pandemic, they had terrible repression and crushed. None of those countries have a protection of freedom of speech. Mm. I don't know of any country around the world that has. They might have the heritage, like English-speaking countries like Canada, they do. They know that they're supposed to have free speech, but they have no protection for it.
Right.
Yeah, and we do. As much as a piece of paper is, but it's more our commitment to defend that piece of paper. So,
well, you're certainly exercising that right. Who is the most brilliant person you've ever met?
That's hard for me to pick. It really is. In my life, I've had opportunity to rub shoulders with a lot of really, really smart men, and a few women too. But, one that I admired and looked up to was like the president of my school when I was in Southeast Asia, John Lillis. It was funny. I think he was from Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken, but he had a Southern accent, but he was Phi Beta Capita and decades ago, he was working on, like, I forget, like missile technology or, whatever. But then a lot of people, like with him and his wife, though, they would say, they would automatically say that you're a dummy because of the Southern accent. But he was smart as a whip and a good mind. But when I really think about it, I went back to try to isolate one person, and that would be when my college. I went to Baptist Bible College in Clark Summit, Pennsylvania, and a history teacher, Western Civ teacher that I had, Dr. Rembert Carter. He was, I would say he was a genius. He would just speak, and this knowledge would just flow endlessly from him. And we called him Mr. Baptist. Of course, I went to a Baptist school, but I never met anybody who knew so much history and church history, and specifically the history of the Baptist, I'll say heritage, I'll say it that way, because there were a lot of people in the world who believed in Baptist principles but weren't necessarily identified as Baptists. He used to stutter, and I heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, that the reason he did is that his mind was working faster than his mouth would go. But, we called him Mr. Baptist. And I had him also for a Greek teacher. And, just to sit around a small room with him and like read from the Greek New Testament and him just expound on things. And it was, it was almost, and I got to be careful with this, but you're just in awe sitting at, a man who was so accomplished. So he was, I think, the smartest man that I'd ever met.
You started to hint at this just a few minutes ago, but is there a book you could recommend?
Yeah, I noted two of them. One of them, I gave you a copy of it sometime. The other one I haven't, but I have it, and I'll lend it to you if you want to read it. And that one is called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution.
Oh, I would love that.
I mentioned a little bit about like the people arguing for 15 years. And specifically, there was a decade when it got close to the revolution and formulation, birthing America, where, they really hammered and tonged. And like I said, to me, I enjoyed it for a couple of reasons. Number one, to see the focus of what went into the development of America, and it's codified for us on paper with the Declaration and the Constitution. And the two can't be separated. The Constitution is kind of like the expression of the Declaration as it relates to how you're going to govern what's in the Declaration. That's how I see the two. But it gave me an appreciation for the arguments. And my goodness, that like I said, they talked about theology and philosophy, history. I mean, it was just amazing. Today we're talking about like the nation is consumed with this Will Smith slapping.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, and people argue about it and debate that, and it's trivial crap, if I can use any other word. And here these men, and it wasn't just a select few. There were all kind of people. They argued about this stuff in the pulpits. The pastors preached it. So the common man was exposed to it. This is what their daily life was. It was in the newspapers. It was in pamphlets. It's thousands and thousands of publications. So I admire that book for that because it gave me insight into more detail as to what it was. But then also just the nature of what those early Americans were like. And, to me, I regard the founders as geniuses and really, really unique men. To me, they're God-gifted men in a certain way. And so I valued that book for that reason. The other one, I got it sitting over there, and that is American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. I think that book, every American ought to read it. Because when it talks about the secret assault, and I've alluded to it already by way of the Democrats, because the Democrats have pretended to be loyal Americans. They never have been. From the very beginning days of slavers, they have been working to undo the Constitution. Then in the early 1900s, with Wilson and the Democrats, they undermined the Constitution. So much so that today, They'll say they honored the Constitution, but the Constitution of the Democrats is a counterfeit Constitution. And the Bill of Rights that they have is a counterfeit Bill of Rights. Like I said there, with FDR up to today, they talk about a second Bill of Rights. The Democrats' second Bill of Rights supersedes our Bill of Rights. Because like Biden said, no, they're not absolute. We can change those. So to themselves, again, they arrogate to themselves to the prerogatives of God, that they'll give you that. From the earliest days, Democrats have worked to subvert America. And some of it is very, very clear. But I'll just talk about like the modern age and with what happened, like going into, like from Wilson on with World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of these forces that we even see today that are taking place, there, to me, is a Marxist coup attempting to subvert America. And so I think that book lays out a lot of it. And that's why I think that every American ought to read that book to expose the secret assault, to see the real assault that is taking place. Going back again to FDR, his administration was filled with communists. He appointed communists to serve on the founding committee of the UN. And so we wonder why the UN is so bankrupt today. Well, look where it started. It started with communists on the organizing committee. So those two books, I would say. I mean, there's scores of good books. But as far as being an American, when I thought about two, I thought, well, that one to show us our beginning, and then the other one to show how the ongoing assault by the Democrats has been. That lays out only a part of it. You could read anything about progressives to see that assault, because progressivism is actually Marxism.
Well, going to a different topic, what do you admire most in another person?
I think that it has to be like the qualities of like some of the things that we've talked about here. Truth, a person is going to be truthful. Loyalty means a lot to me. I've had friends stand by me, and I've stood by friends, but I know times too when I've broken those things in my own life, and the pain is, that's resulted in the harm that gets done. So I know, what I know what I, admire. Truthfulness, honesty, loyalty. And today, those things to me all combine and wrap up because of the threat. I'm going to relate it to politics again. Because unfortunately, going back to the beginning, like you asked about what America was like of the 50s, America was free. There was a freedom in America that we don't have today. When I was a teenager, for example, I lived in a fairly good-sized town. I don't remember the size of it at that time, but I had my best friend. He lived probably about 2 miles away from me. I could put my shotgun over my shoulder, have my hunting clothes on, and walk down one street after another through our town and have a cop ride by you, wave at the cop, and I'd pick him up, and then from where he lived on the edge of town, and then we could just walk across his street, and we'd be in the woods and start hunting for the day. But I had that kind of freedom. When our high school, one of our gym teachers, Danny Devers, he was a big duck hunter. We could go to his house and, he'd teach us, give us information about duck hunting. He'd show us his guns, etc. And so there was a freedom, and we don't have that today. But now, like a kid, if you point your finger at somebody, they accuse you of, like assault with a deadly weapon. The kids can't even play, guns, cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians or anything like that. And those are small things, but we definitely have like a crushing of our free speech and others too. The Democrats are assaulting all of our rights and our liberty. And so for me, I'm rambling a little bit, but trying to connect it in my mind. Like I said, being truthful, being loyal, being honest, in this day and age, that combines to me to be patriotic, to be a patriot. Because America, to me, as I look at it, we're in the 12th hour. I don't want to be a doomsayer or a pessimist, but what I look at, the light of America is going out. And that's by intent, by plan, by purpose of the Democrats. They want to crush our lights, or, snuff our light out and crush our rights. And so to me, and I have the privilege of knowing, because I was a Marine and served with so many people, and I still communicate with them and see their spirit, and they want to preserve America, Looking at the news this morning, for example, there was one, Brett Velikovich. He served in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. And he's now, not unlike other Marines and Army guys who were in Ukraine. Some of them are actually fighting. They got a rifle in their hands. But others of them are there and they're defending oppressed people like Velikovich. He's like taking supplies over to them and all of that kind of stuff. Or like when Afghanistan fell, when the Afghanistans and the Americans there were betrayed by Biden and the Democrats, there was all kind of veterans who went back in there to rescue people. And so for me, my heart beats for those kind of people who, they're a patriot here, but that patriotism is like you're going to defend oppressed people, Now, I was a Marine, but I admire Green Berets. And, they talk about their motto. I'm not sure I can quote it exactly, but I think it's like to free the oppressed. And that's certainly a worthy motto. And I see them living that out. So, when I see men like that today, that's what I admire in people, So.
This last question, I was thinking there's going to be people who listen to this who either find themselves strongly agreeing with what you have to say.
Yeah.
Or vehemently
I know that. Yeah.
Opposed to what you have to say.
Yeah.
If you could include all of them, everybody who's listening, wherever or whenever they hear this, what would you say to them?
I don't know what to say, except, I get flack from Democrats all the time, but it's always on the basis of ideology and emotions. And emotions, primarily hatred. And when I challenge them, like I get called a fascist, they'll say, and some of these people will say I'm a fascist. And I say, prove it. What is there about me as a fascist that you see in Hitler? His actions, jot down his words, and then compare mine and tell me how I'm a fascist. So I'm just saying that to get to this point. Pretty much everything I've said, I can back up. I can show you the history of the Democrats, and I've alluded to them. I haven't given you specifics, for example. I've pretty much like talking about Wilson and his regard for the Declaration and the Constitution. The Constitution, the Declaration, he said it was irrelevant for us today. The Constitution, what he said was that it was ineffective for a modern society to govern them. All right. And he said that all the way back, like 110 years ago or whatever it was. And so to those who would disagree with me, like for me, I know his words, and I would point them. Well, you go back and study it yourself. See what he actually said. Then tell me if I'm wrong, So I know my history because I read it. These, most of the critics, they haven't read their history. All they know is they can regurgitate the sound bites and the approved propaganda scripts of their party. So there's the truth. Study the truth. Find the truth for yourself. So.
And what about those people who are listening who say, right on?
I give them a high five.
Well, thank you very much for this.
Uh-huh.
Thank you for answering these questions so carefully.
All right, thank you.
Enjoyed.
I enjoyed it too, Paul.
Thank you for stopping by today. If you enjoyed our program, consider telling a friend about it. The Paul Leslie Hour is made possible through people just like you. So you want to keep the show going, right? Go to thepaulleslie.com. That's thepaulleslie.com. Click on Support the Show. And thanks to everyone who contributes. Performance of the intro music is courtesy of John Primorano, The Entertainer, written by Scott Joplin. End credit theme music is courtesy of John Primorano, the traditional song Corina Corina. Your announcer is Dan Gold. Hey, that's me! The show is hosted and produced by Paul Leslie. And we'll see you next time on the Paul Leslie Hour.